Your hand will hold me still, even when my world is shaking. Your hand will hold me still. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made.
Hello, welcome to Theology Chat on Tuesday night. What we like to do on Tuesday nights is try and talk about the sermon on Sunday. We try and take some of the theological concepts behind what was going on there, maybe explain them, break them down into bite-sized chunks, or define terms, maybe answer some questions that came up from the sermon, or talk about any questions that came up between then and now about the sermon. So that's what we do every Tuesday, and so we're going to just jump right in. We started a new series talking about the book of Romans, and so the book of Romans was written by the Apostle Paul, and he kind of we jumped right in chapter 3, and Pastor Melissa was reading that on Sunday morning, and he started talking about the law. Let me pull that verse up. And he says, "Therefore no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law we become conscious of our sin." And now, Pastor Melissa was talking about, like, he was referencing the law of Israel, the Ten Commandments, all the books of the law in the Old Testament. If you think about, actually, Paul himself was a Pharisee, and so the Pharisees, they had this long list of hundreds of laws and rules that were from the book of the law. Some of it was the Pharisees taking that and saying, well, if we want to do this, then we need to do this, this, and this. And so they would kind of add to in an attempt to be even more righteous. But when Paul's talking about the law here, he's saying, look, God gave us the law. God gave us the Ten Commandments. He gave us the laws in the book, in the books of the law. And it's not that the law is bad, but trying to follow the law and being able to follow the law and thinking that is what is making us righteous, he's saying that doesn't work. And all through the New Testament, this is said over and over again. You know, the law, we tried to follow the law, but every time we're always messing up. We're always messing up. We're always messing up. There's a reason there's a sacrificial system in the Old Testament. It's because nobody could keep the law. And he's saying, sorry, I think I got something in my eye. He's saying the law doesn't make us righteous. But the law is helpful because it shows us our sin. It points out to us where we're not measuring up. It's like, you know how you fix an old car when you hear a really funky sound coming from the engine? You turn the radio up, okay? Having the radio up is just going through life without the law. When you turn the radio down and you can actually hear what the engine is doing, that's like having the law there to say, wait a minute, I know what an engine is supposed to sound like, and that's not it. Okay? That's kind of the difference between having the law and not having the law. That doesn't fix the engine, but it tells you something's not right here. All right? And so Paul starts off in this book, in the book of Romans, talking about the sin problem that we have. And we as humanity have a sin problem. So first of all, we need to talk about what is sin. So as far as a definition, the definition that I've always liked has been a willful disobedience of a known law of God. It's kind of short and sweet and easy. You know you're not supposed to do something, and you do it. Or you know you're supposed to do something, and you don't do it. Okay? God's given us the law. He's told us how he wants us to live. And when we don't do that, or we do stuff that he tells us not to do, that's breaking a known law of God. We know what we're supposed to do or what we're not supposed to do, and we disregard it. Short and sweet. So there's your history lesson for the night. Susanna Wesley told her boys this: whatever weakens, actually, I think I got this. Yeah, here we go. Whatever weakens your reason, impairs the tenderness of your conscience, obscures your sense of God, takes off your relish for spiritual things, whatever increases the authority of the body over the mind, that thing is a sin to you, however innocent it may seem in itself. So she's saying sin can be not only breaking a known law of God, it can be fudging those lines of where that boundary is. It can be letting anything get between you and God. That sort of stuff. It's and that's a little harder to define, because for each person that might be a little bit different. For somebody who has a problem with pride, it may be a sin to take pride in themselves, because they may have a problem doing that. Okay, but for somebody who is constantly putting themselves down and not seeing the good that God has created in them, it might be a sin not to recognize the good that God has done in them. It's getting between what God, and so it's a little that gets a little bit more complicated, but can always fall back to known law of God. Willfully disobeying that is definitely sin. But you gotta be careful. Anything that's getting between God's intention for you and you, that can become sin as well, or can be sin as well. So why is sin important? Sin equals death. Sin is death. It says in the Bible, the wages of sin is death. And why is that? Well, the reason why is because God is the source of all life. Everything that we have as far as life, that is life-giving, that is good, noble, all of that is from God. And the problem with sin is sin breaks that relationship with God and cuts us off from that. And so it's like when we sin, we cut ourselves off from life. And in a sense, we kind of cut off our life support, to think of it that way. And so it's like we bring it on ourselves when we sin. We bring that death onto ourselves. Now when we've talked about this before, there's original sin and then there is personal sin. Original sin, when we talk about original sin, we talk about the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and the story of humanity basically disobeying, actually at the time, the one commandment that they had. God said not to eat of the fruit of that tree, and humanity said we're going to do it our way. And I say humanity because really it was the two people. So all of humanity decided we're going to do this. And so so that's original sin. And now we recognize the idea that actions have consequences. And so the consequences of that disobedience, that sin against God, because again, if it's willful disobedience of a known law of God, God told them, don't do this, they did it. And so they sinned. The consequences, the results of that, was that sin entered the world. Our world is in a fallen condition. It's why we have a lot of the evils that go on in our world, because it's a fallen world, because sin has entered, because of original sin. And so we still live with the consequences of that every day. We live with all the consequences of a world that has allowed sin to come in and to start working its way through all kinds of things, individuals, groups, structures. Sin has worked its way into pretty much everywhere. And so that is the consequences of original sin. Now, there is another consequence that has happened because of original sin, and that is what we in the I'm sorry, I forgot to talk about personal sin. I'm reevaluating here. Okay, so personal sin real quick, and then I'll finish up with this. Personal sin is when I do something, I know that this is, God wants me to do this, and then I decide not to do that. Or I know that God doesn't want me to do this, and I do it anyway. That is a personal sin. I have acted in disobedience to a known law of God. Okay? It's something that I did. Original sin, I was not personally there for it. I did not personally do that. But we're reaping the consequences of it. Okay? I hope that's clear about the difference between the two. Original sin is something we inherit as humanity. It's just the state of this world being basically tainted by sin. And personal sin is something that I have personally done and that I am responsible for. Now, again, to go back to what I was saying before, one of the consequences of the original sin is that we've inherited this, what we call a sinful nature. And what that is God created us good. Okay? That was his original intent for humanity. And we were able to be good. But when we chose to sin, that human nature, that good nature that we had was corrupted or was tainted from God's original design. And so now human nature is kind of bent towards sin. If you think about, and there's all kinds of analogies for this, and as we like to say, all analogies break down at some point. But the analogy that I like to think of with regards to the sinful nature is it's like a car that is out of alignment. And if you've never driven a car that's out of alignment, it veers off to one side. So if you're driving and you got your hands on the wheel, you're fine. But as soon as if you would let go of the wheel and you're still pushing on the gas, the car is going to start veering off to the side, and eventually you're going to wind up in a ditch on the side of the road. Okay, that's kind of how I like to. That's the word picture I like to use for the sinful nature, because it's constantly trying to push us off the road. Like if the road is the way that God wants us to be living, this sinful nature is constantly trying to push us off. Constantly, we're always fighting to keep the car on the road. That was never God's intention for us. God's original design was that we were good, we were created good, and we were going to live in fellowship with him. But again, that consequence of the original sin is that our nature was tainted. Now, with that, well, and actually from the beginning, we as humanity, we as human beings, God has given us free will. Okay? And what that means is he's given us the ability to make choices. Even in the garden, humanity had a choice. God said, do not eat this fruit, but he did not make it so that they were physically incapable of doing it. Okay? It was a choice. Now, some people might say, well, why would God design a system that could fail? We were created because God wanted to have a love relationship with us. That is why God created humanity. And so when you think about wanting to have a loving relationship with someone where they have no choice in the matter. That's You can't really say that it's a loving relationship when the other person has no choice. At that point, they're just a robot. They're just an automaton, and they're doing what you tell them to do because it's not a choice that they make. God wanted us to choose Him. And that is that concept of free will. In everything that we do, we have free will. We have a choice. Now, with that choice comes responsibility. God's told us the way that we're to live. And so when we choose not to do that, we're responsible for the consequences of that. When we sin against God, we are responsible for the consequences. We can't, I've never heard somebody honestly say this, but the phrase "the devil made me do it" is not going to fly with God, because we have a choice, and so we need to take responsibility for our choices and for our actions and the consequences of those. And so all that to say that we have free will, and it's a blessing, but it's also, when we have that choice, we've always got that choice to hold on to the steering wheel and keep us on the road and fight that sinful nature, or to just let go and let it drive us off the road. We always have that choice. Obviously, God's will is that we would stay on the road, but that's up to us. That's not the entire story, because sanctification comes into the picture later in the book of Romans, but I don't want to jump ahead on that. So just kind of jump over this again. Like, we were created good. Sin entered the world through the original sin, and because of that, we have this bent towards sin and away from God, called the sinful nature. And when we what's the word I'm looking for? When we cater to that sinful nature, when we give in to that sinful nature and we sin against God, that is personal sin, because it's something that we have personally chosen to do out of our free will. All right. Now, this is all under the assumption that, and the doctrine that we believe in, that humanity's nature is tainted from God's original intention. That's what that original sin, that sinful nature is that we believe we've inherited. Just going to bring another quick history lesson in here. In the first several centuries of the church, after Jesus died, was risen, and ascended into heaven, the first several centuries, there was a lot of debate and arguing and trying to figure out and flesh out the doctrine of what does this all mean. Because we sit here and we've got 2,000 years of people having sat down and tried to figure this all out. And so we have the benefit of hindsight in this. But especially those first several hundred centuries, people were looking at all this stuff and trying to figure it out and making their best guess. And some of them were going down some weird paths. Some of them were focusing on one thing to the detriment of other things. And so there was this constant debate about what is sound doctrine, what is the word is orthodox theology, orthodox with a small o, meaning right belief, as opposed to with a capital O, meaning like the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so I say all that to say, in the early church history, there was a lot of debate, and there were some theologies, there were some thoughts about God that were deemed as heretical. They were heresies. And so one of those I want to talk about is one called Pelagianism. And now Pelagianism was named after a guy named, you're never going to guess, Pelagius. He lived from 354 to 418 AD. And the problem with Pelagianism was that they believed that original sin didn't taint the human nature, and that our will is still capable of choosing good or evil without any help from God. Okay? That last piece right there is the important piece in this heresy. They would say, we are perfectly capable of choosing good or evil without God giving us any help. Okay? That's a problem because the church, after having thought through this for hundreds and now thousands of years, has recognized that human nature is broken from its original intention, broken to the point that we are, without the help of God, unable to reach out to God for help, and to make good moral choices on our own. It is we've talked before about prevenient grace, and that is God giving his grace to us before we even recognize it, before we even want it, before we even know that it's a thing. That is God reaching out to us. And then we can say, oh, okay, thank you. Grab a hold of that hand and then have him lift us up. And then we're able to make good moral choices. What Pelagius is saying is, okay, God might be reaching out, but we're perfectly fine of reaching up ourselves and pulling ourselves up. That's kind of the difference between that. That kind of denies that humanity has a broken, sinful nature. And so that's where that became a problem. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, I bring it up because how does that show up in today's world? It shows up when we think that people are just naturally good and that we can be good people without God. That's how that shows up. It shows up when we think that people are naturally good and that we can be good people without God. Now, I need to clarify that because we are all created in the image of God, and so there is that inherent goodness. However, our nature is still broken. We still have that bent towards sin. And so for us to say we can be good people without God, and we don't need his help, that would be kind of a more modern take on what Pelagius thought. And so that we can, that's just something that we need to be careful of, that we don't slip into that unintentionally. If we're following God, obviously we're constantly looking to him to say, okay, God, what is good? What is right? We read the Bible to see what God has said about what is the way that I am to live this life. And so that's why we do that, because we need his help. We need him to direct us, instead of just relying on our own thoughts. What that can wind up doing, if you don't rely on God, you can take morality and just basically create it into whatever you want it to be. If you're not, in a worst case scenario, you can just go around saying, this is moral, this is moral, this is not. And basically just deciding what I want it to be, as opposed to saying what God wants it to be. And the reality is that's not what God has declared as good. It is not what God is advocating for. It is nothing about what God wants for us. God wants us to be looking to him in all things, but especially in our ability to make good and wise choices. So that is kind of sin in a nutshell. We're going to be talking some more over the book of Romans here about, there's a lot, I'll just tell you, there's a lot theologically in the book of Romans, and so there's no way that I'm going to be able to touch it all. But we're talking about talked about sin this week. We're going to be talking about forgiveness, redemption, regeneration, that kind of stuff, being adopted into God's family. All of that stuff is jam-packed into Romans, and it is chock full of good stuff, chock full of good theology, and a lot about what God wants for every human. So if you've never read the book of Romans, I would recommend you read it. And then that's all that I have for this week. So I guess if you read it, then we'll talk about it next week. So that's all. I will see you Sunday, or if not Sunday, I'll see you next Tuesday.